All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. Today we will be continuing our look at postmodern fiction. In our last lecture, we looked at Thomas Pynchon and his story Entropy, which told, I think, sort of an allegory about the greater openness of the postmodern worldview versus the sort of deadly closure of the modernist worldview. This was a kind of almost an allegory or a parable about postmodernism, and I would argue that something very similar happens in Grace Paley's A Conversation with My Father, which we also read for this week, which also staged a confrontation between an older, arguably modernist worldview that was more closed and more deterministic versus an open and more pluralistic postmodernist worldview. So those two stories were both postmodern stories, I would say, and stories about postmodernism. For the next two lectures, though, I want to look at a different facet of postmodernism and its relation to fiction and to literature. So I mentioned when we began to talk about what postmodernism was 2 weeks ago that one of its features is a breaking down of barriers between what was considered high culture, the culture of the elite, poetry and symphonies and gallery paintings on the one hand, and what was called low culture or mass culture, the culture of the populace, which was newspapers and magazines and comic books and movies and radio and then popular music, etc. And so one of the consequences of postmodernism, or I don't know if I don't actually know if postmodernism could be a consequence of this could be a consequence of postmodernism. It's hard to determine cause in complicated cultural matters like this. But one of the things that accompanies postmodernism as we go into the second half of the 20th century is a breakdown of these barriers between what was considered high literature and what was considered low culture, low literature. And we already saw a little bit of that in Frank O'Hara's poetry, which brings in references to all sorts of different cultural domains and pays tribute both to avant-garde painters and popular singers and things like that. I want to look at a more specific aspect of this question with regard to fiction today in our next two lectures. So that is one consequence that postmodernism had for fiction, was the breaking down of the boundary between what was considered proper fiction, which was generally realistic, and what was called genre fiction, which were genres of literature that were mostly not realistic. And so realist fiction was considered the fiction, properly read by the discerning, the elite, the educated reader, whereas the masses would read science fiction, fantasy, horror, mystery, romance, even you could even put pornography in this category. So what happens in the 60s, though, is that you start to see the breaking down of this barrier. Now, this barrier itself wasn't that old by the 60s. So the barrier between realist fiction being considered the elite norm and then genre fiction being considered low and disreputable is really something that only arises in the late 19th century. Before that, you had works that were arguably non-realistic in genre existing alongside works in the realist genre without much of a problem. In the early 19th century, you have Jane Austen writing her realist novels that are also romantic comedies, which is its own genre, and then you have Mary Shelley writing the pioneering science fiction horror of Frankenstein, and they're sort of going together, and there's not like a judgment that Frankenstein is inappropriate, though this is getting started. Once realism really develops in the 18th century, it has its partisans saying it's superior to all other forms of literature. This goes with a kind of Enlightenment bias toward rationality and against talking about things like the supernatural or whatever. But really, when the division sets in is in the late 19th century, when you have an expansion of public education, and you have also developments in printing, which lead to a mass market for all sorts of written material. So you have, more educated people who can read, but who aren't necessarily receiving the kinds of formal elite educations that the upper classes got before them. And then you have this greater mass of printed material. So you get this division between what the elites and what the masses are reading. And it's around then that the distinction is codified between realism and then genre fiction. And this persists right through the 50s. So, ambitious writers starting out like James Baldwin or Philip Roth or Flannery O'Connor just take it for granted that they're going to write basically realistic fiction. And they do, with some variations, and some they do interesting things with realism, and they don't write in a particularly elitist way, but they mostly write realistic fiction. Then, though, in the 60s, I would argue, is when this really starts to break down. And there's a couple things we could look at here for explanations. I already mentioned postmodernism kind of as an ideology that's now starting to overtake writers of all sorts. And postmodernism, with its emphasis on pluralism, is saying that you can't really maintain these barriers between high and low. And media is changing, and media, it becomes harder and harder to sort of, because everything sort of becomes fodder for the mass media. So we talked about the paperback revolution of the mid-20th century. Now, all books are being published as easily accessible paperbacks, whether they are elite literature, classic literature, or whether they are mass market science fiction, fantasy, detective fiction, horror. And so it's all coming to sort of seem equal. And as you're getting, I would argue there's kind of an academic side too, which is people are realizing that the history of fiction is much more pluralistic, and they're seeing that genres like science fiction, fantasy, horror, mystery, and others go back way, deep into the 19th century, and you have figures like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, who were not writing realist fiction and are yet considered classic. So with the breakdown of this barrier between literary fiction, i.e. realism, and genre fiction, I think the breakdown occurs on two levels. It occurs on both the level of writers who want to be sort of considered great writers, and who then turn to genre forms in order to pursue literature and don't necessarily write strict realism. And we see that in a writer like Thomas Pynchon, who writes arguably science fictional elements in his fiction throughout from the beginning of his career. And you see his interest in science, and I think you see an entropy the way that his fiction is not quite realist in the way that Philip Roth or James Baldwin was. And other writers like, we're going to read Ishmael Reed next week. I think we're going to read a nonfiction piece by him, but his fiction also partakes very much of science fiction and detective fiction and fantasy fiction. And Pynchon and Reed were writers who I think wanted to publish more or less literary fiction in the main, and were kind of received that way, even though they were breaking down this barrier. But then on the other side, on the side of commercial fiction, you also have genre writers who are writing in the commercial marketplace of science fiction and fantasy. Because you have to understand, publishing has multiple tiers. And so, there's what's called general fiction, and then there's what's called commercial fiction. And these have different kind of marketing apparatuses and different, professional editors attached to them. So when you enter the fiction market, you're going to kind of enter on one of these two tracks. And so my point is that Pynchon and I think Reed, maybe at least in his later career, entered on the general fiction track, and yet they were using all the tropes and trappings of commercial science fiction and detective fiction. On the other side, the people who entered the commercial fiction track, and you might say, what's the difference? Well, on the literary side, you would publish your books first in hardcover for a more elite audience, and then they'd later come out in paperbacks. Where on the commercial side, you often got paperback originals, which were intended right away for a more mass audience. So there's all these economic considerations. So on the literary general fiction side, you have writers borrowing the tropes and trappings of quote-unquote genre fiction. And then on the commercial side, you have a new generation, particularly, I think, in science fiction, who are wanting to use the forms of science fiction to make more serious and more nuanced kinds of points. And you have a kind of revolution, again, particularly in science fiction in the 60s, a turn toward more political work, more literarily experimental work, more socially engaged work. It's often described as a turn from science fiction in the early 20th century was more concerned with the hard, or I don't know if that's the right term, the natural sciences, with physics and with chemistry and with extrapolating developments in physics and chemistry, often from a kind of uninterrogated nationalistic or militaristic view. And then you have a turn toward more social science oriented science fiction in the 60s with writers like the ones we'll be reading this week, like Philip K. Dick and Ursula K. Le Guin, as well as others such as Samuel R. Delany and Octavia Butler, who are great writers but who aren't in our anthology. So we're having a breakdown of the barriers in fiction that I think you'll see over the course of our semester. By the time we get to the end, a lot of these distinctions have just collapsed, and they're really just writers, and writers are sort of writing in all genres, and even the commercial distinctions between popular and literary fiction, I would argue, have tended to break down a little. So that's kind of an introduction to one aspect of postmodernism and its kind of practical effects that we haven't yet discussed. It's what are the practical effects on publishing and on literature of the postmodern breaking of the barriers between what used to be considered high culture and low culture. And so I think, and one of the clear consequences is that in an anthology of literature intended for college students like the Norton Anthology, we now have science fiction written by writers who were publishing in very commercial venues like Dick and Le Guin, alongside writers like Baldwin and Roth, who are publishing in very highbrow intellectual organs. So that breaking down of the barriers is something I think we almost now take for granted. So with that, I want to turn to some stories, one story by Philip K. Dick and two very brief stories by Ursula K. Le Guin, and look at what they are doing with the genre of science fiction. So this, from now on, this will be a lecture on Philip K. Dick, and then I'll do another one on Ursula K. Le Guin. So who was Philip K. Dick? He lived not a very long life, from 1928 to 1982. He was born in Chicago, but raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of his fiction is kind of centered around, a lot of his fiction takes place like on Mars and on other planets, but when he's on Earth, he often writes about California. And I think we mentioned that, and that's going to be true of Le Guin as well, who comes from Northern California and then also the Pacific Northwest. So we mentioned in the 1950s with countercultural writers, and I think there was a lot of counterculture interest in science fiction as something that would break down the deadly realistic boundaries of literary fiction. You see this move from what was the Eastern New York-centered publishing establishment to a greater interest in West Coast literature, centered particularly on San Francisco. Anyway, that's a digression. So he was raised in the Bay Area, and he lived in Berkeley and attended Berkeley High School in the exact same class as Ursula K. Le Guin, the class of 1947, though they didn't know each other. And then he attended UC Berkeley briefly, but didn't take a degree. Just to round out his biography, he was married 5 times, disastrously, terrible husband. Not a lot of happy marriages in mid-20th century American literature, as I think we've seen. I guess John Ashbery had a happy marriage. I think aside from that, pretty miserable. And Dick is no exception. But he was very productive and very prolific, which I think was part of his unhappiness. He was writing, again, in a very competitive commercial market of science fiction, and he ends up in his short life writing 44 novels and 121 short stories. And I don't want to mince words. One of the reasons he was able to be so productive, and it's a theme in his work and it's a theme in his life, and it's again a theme we've seen over and over again in mid-20th century American literature, is that drugs had a lot to do with it. He was taking amphetamines, and he used amphetamines which he seems in this story to take for granted will just be freely available in vending machines in the future. He took amphetamines to be as productive as he was. He would write, a novel in 2 weeks, which, if you've never written a novel, that's not easy. And it's not easy to write a good novel in 2 weeks. And a lot of his stuff isn't that good, to be perfectly honest. And none of it is very carefully written, though it's all very interestingly speculative. Well, I don't know about it all. I haven't read that much Philip K. Dick, but what I've read the books considered his masterpieces, such as the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and The Man in the High Castle, are very kind of speculatively interesting. And he says in the quote in the bio that the Norton Anthology gives, he says, "I am a fictionalizing philosopher, not a novelist." He didn't consider himself a novelist in the sense of writing these like fine art works of fiction. He considered himself someone coming up with kind of philosophical metaphors, and he was mainly interested in philosophical questions. When you read his work, you don't really get rich language of the sort you find in Pynchon or Baldwin, and you don't get sort of carefully drawn characters of the kind we saw in Cheever. You get more of a philosophical speculation on questions of what is reality, what is human consciousness, what does it mean to be a human, do we have souls, what is our media doing to us, what are totalitarian governments and corporations doing to us. These are the questions that he asks over and over again. And he said he once remarked that his fiction took up two large questions: what is human and what is real. And he did lead a tumultuous life, as they say in the bio, that added to the urgency of his questions because he struggled for decades with paranoia, mental illness, and drug addiction. And let's just be clear, some of the paranoia was warranted. He was he's starting to write in the 50s, in the time of McCarthyism, where anybody who's suspected of having left-wing affiliations could be investigated. James Baldwin had a huge FBI file on him. He was under investigation and even surveillance by the FBI, for instance, because they thought he was a communist. He wasn't. Neither was Philip K. Dick, exactly. But Philip K. Dick probably was being surveilled by the FBI early in his life, as a lot of writers were. Writers, even from the earlier period that you probably read in high school, like Hemingway, were being surveilled, investigated. We saw, that wasn't widely known until the late 60s, but we saw what the CIA was doing with interfering in the production of art. And so, and by the way, the communist governments were doing stuff like this as well, even more overtly. So when we talk about paranoia in the mid-20th century, I don't want to suggest that all these people were just crazy, because they weren't. There was a very high degree of surveillance, of state interference, of all of these things. So some of the paranoia was an accurate perception of a world that was becoming ever less free. Sorry if you can hear that. I think there's a garbage truck outside backing up. However, paranoia can also be a mental problem. And I think Dick had that as well. And I think it was exacerbated by his pharmacological habits. Now, he has, in the last decade of his life, he has a religious vision. He has again, I'm sorry if you can hear that. There's a very loud thing happening outside my window. He is having a religious vision he sees a pink light that kind of beams this revelation to him. And he becomes convinced that he was a persecuted martyr in ancient Rome, that he had access to a vast cosmic intelligence, that America was being threatened. So, interestingly, he might have been a target of the FBI because they thought he was a communist early in his career. By the end of his life, he began to fear communists around every corner. So he began to think that America was under this communist threat, and he contacted the FBI to give them names of people he suspected of being communist agents, including Frederick Jameson, the literary theorist of postmodernism we talked about last week, who praised and extolled Dick. Jameson said Dick was the Shakespeare of science fiction. And yet Dick was very suspicious of Jameson and thought because he was a Marxist theorist, that he was a communist agent. He wasn't. I think Jameson's Marxism is altogether a more mental affair, I would suggest. So he becomes very paranoid, and a lot of his later work is devoted to explaining this religious vision, and most famously the novel Valis, Valis, which is an acronym for Vast Advanced Living Intelligent System, which has something to do with the cosmic consciousness he thought he was in contact with. I don't know. Should you read? I read Valis when I was 14 years old. I have to tell you, I don't remember that much about it, and I don't remember if I recommend it. But it really is interesting if you're interested in kind of the literature of visionary experiences and their consequences. It's a novel, but it's sort of a memoir about this religious vision that he has. So that's an interesting book. That was the first book by Philip K. Dick I ever read. I don't know why I read it when I was 14. I think I saw a reference to it in a comic book. So anyway, no, that's a pointless digression. Anyway, so this is Dick's life. He dies quite young at age 50, or I don't know. I can't do math. 1928 to 1982. He died the year I was born of a stroke, probably from the very hard living he'd been doing. But after his death, he became regarded as a major writer who inspired Hollywood, for one thing. So the movie Blade Runner that came out 4 months after his death, which is considered one of the great American movies, was inspired by his novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Other classic movies, famous movies, Total Recall, Minority Report, also inspired directly by his work. And then a lot of movie directors who weren't directly adapting his work were inspired by it, like Darren Aronofsky and Christopher Nolan and David Cronenberg. So he's had a huge influence on pop culture and in as I mentioned, in comic books, influencing works by Alan Moore and Grant Morrison and famous comic book writers as well. So that's on the pop culture side, but we mentioned there's this breaking down of barriers of high and low culture. He's also very highly regarded in academia, which is what he's doing in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, starting with Jameson, who compared him to Shakespeare. I don't really know why. I don't see any comparison between Philip K. Dick and Shakespeare, but that was the phrase he used. But he was the first science fiction writer, for instance, to enter the prestigious Library of America series, which is this beautifully hardcover bound set of volumes of classic American literature. Now, listen, pretty much every writer we've read up to now was in the Library of America series, and I didn't mention it because it was just sort of natural that they would be. But Dick was the first science fiction writer, and he entered it in 2007, so fairly recently, and is regarded not only as a major science fiction writer, but as a major postmodern writer, asking these postmodern questions about reality and what it means, especially as it pertains to new technologies that can, divorce us from the real, as a postmodern theorist like Baudrillard would say. So that's my introduction to Philip K. Dick. I show him here with a cat because I found pictures of Philip K. Dick and Ursula K. Le Guin with cats because all the stories we're reading from them feature cats in them. So that's why the picture. So the story we read, after all that, I have to say, I find Philip K. Dick's life a little bit more interesting than his work. So I was more interested to talk about his life than I am to talk about this story. I find this story slightly self-explanatory in a way. I don't have an enormous amount to say about it. So it's called Precious Artifact, and it's written in the 60s. And it posits a future which appears to be a future. She's writing in 1964 or something, and it appears that the events have taken place around like the 20 teens. So luckily, the terrible future he depicts here doesn't come to pass. But let me just note, I haven't really made any general remarks about science fiction. Science fiction shouldn't really be judged as predictive. The writers aren't really, sometimes they're trying to extrapolate, so given this present, what will the future look like? But more often, I would say the future in science fiction, which is always, what is science fiction? It's fiction that is about generally the future or some kind of advanced technology and what its social consequences would be, or contact with aliens, which is also what this story is about. And so the future is often a kind of allegory for the writer's present. An allegory is a story in which the elements of the story refer to some other meaning, to some higher meaning. The story's not just about itself, it's about something else. And I think you can clearly see this as a Cold War story. It's a story about two superpower governments sort of battling over territory. And as they battle over territory, they're perpetually lying to the citizens and distorting reality so that the citizens don't even really understand the reality they're looking at. And if you think about what the Cold War was, these rival superpowers battling over territory and using mass media and espionage and government surveillance and interference to sort of misdirect the citizenry about what's going on, you see this as a pretty clear allegory for the Cold War. Dick is just taking the rivalry between the US and the USSR, between capitalism and communism, and putting it into this battle between Earth and the Proxmen. I guess the idea is they're from Proxima Centauri, this distant galaxy, and they're fighting over Mars. And they're using, by the way, nuclear weapons, apparently, that can destroy whole worlds. And Dick just puts that Cold War setting into space. And the real question, and you'll notice his hero, and he was always famous for this, the heroes of his fiction are never elites, really. They're always just ordinary people. And that was different from earlier science fiction. Earlier science fiction tended to have like the model of, you know, the hero of the story would be the chosen one who would save the galaxy, and it would be this very superheroic model. And Dick, as we move into this more subtle mode of science fiction in the 60s, that's moving away from some of these somewhat simplistic tropes, Dick is always writing about ordinary people. And that was always what would happen in other writers of the time, like Le Guin and like Samuel R. Delany, is you get this more ground level science fiction. So Precious Artifact, it's about this guy named Milt Biscoe, and all of his characters always have these very mundane names and very mundane lives. And he's a worker who's involved in turning Mars into a habitable environment after this devastating nuclear war between the Proxmen and the Terrans, or the Earth forces. And he thinks that Earth has won this battle. But he's beginning to suspect, because he's paranoid and on amphetamines like his author, he's beginning to suspect that there is some subterfuge going on and that the Proxmen have actually won. So he wants to go back to Earth to see if the Proxmen have destroyed Earth. And right away he's intercepted by a psychiatrist, again this menacing figure of psychiatric science that hangs over mid-20th century literature as someone who doesn't exist to help you but to normalize you. We saw that in Tennessee Williams as well. So he's intercepted by this psychiatrist, and then he's intercepted by this woman who's kind of who's like assigned to accompany him to Earth, and she seduces him to further misdirect him. But what he eventually finds on Earth is that like Philip K. Dick, not all of his paranoia was unjustified, and he finds that Earth was in fact destroyed. And they show him that Earth was mostly destroyed, and they say, look, we can make peace. We Proxmen, he finds out that the woman who was assigned to sort of guard him and who seduced him is a Prox woman, and that the Proxmen have taken over. And they tell him, look, this doesn't have to be bad. I know we won, but we're all humanoids. We can intermate with each other, and you can help us make Earth habitable. You could live on Earth, you can live on Mars. And look, we found this cat that survived, and we're going to give you this cat. Or I think he requests a cat because he has a fond memory of his pet cat. And so they give him this cat, and he goes back to Mars. And what he doesn't know, what only the reader knows, is that they only told him the partial truth. The full truth is that Earth was completely wiped out. Nothing survives. there are no cats. The cat he's holding is an advanced, like, robot, and they call it a simulacrum, which was Jean Baudrillard's word for all that we ever encounter in postmodernity, which is a copy without an original. So there's no original left. There are no cats left. There's only this copy. And we get this through we've been following his perspective. It seemed like a limited third person story where we followed Milt's perspective, but then we get access to the psychiatrist, Dr. De Winter's consciousness. So it's more of an omniscient story by the end, where the narrator can enter multiple perspectives. And the Proxman psychiatrist, Dr. De Winter, is thinking, he'll be fine because he has this cat and he doesn't know the cat's not real. So the cat kind of anchors him in the reality he knows. And they need him because he has this technical expertise. So they need him to go along with them. And so the sort of vertigo the story creates is that basically you can't be too paranoid, that his first suspicion was right. And then they told him half the truth. But he never learns the full truth. He thinks this cat is real, and so he's prepared to go along with them. And so the allegory here is that in a world so totally controlled by state authority and the technology that state authority has access to, the ordinary citizen never has a hope of knowing what's real. It's just impossible, because you're never going to be able to penetrate all of the delusions that these powerful states can create. And there's even almost a reflection, because what's happening too in the Cold War is the Vietnam War is starting to ramp up in the mid-60s, and we saw a reflection of that with the colonial relation between Callisto and Obad in Pynchon's story, and we see a reflection, I think, of it here, where Milt feels essentially that he's this kind of colonial subject, that Dr. De Winter is this expert psychologist who's supposed to know all about Earth psychology. And so the story becomes also a reflection on how these great powers kind of colonize other cultures and become experts on them and use that expertise to manipulate them. And so it's a colonial situation, which was part of the Cold War. The Cold War was an extension of the imperial wars of the previous century, as you have, Russia and the United States still vying over territory, largely in the global south, in Latin America and Asia and Africa, some of the consequences of which we'll talk about in subsequent weeks. So this is a story about paranoia. It's a story about how when power is so powerful that you can't escape it, it's hard not to be paranoid, and you can't be too paranoid. And I think that's what Precious Artifact, and the title I think refers to the cat. It's an ironic title because he thinks he has this precious artifact, the only survivor of Earth in the form of this cat. But even in postmodernity, and even in the Cold War media surround of the mid to late 20th century, you have no access to nature. Nature itself is an illusion, and even your own memories, because he had this memory of the cat, which is why he wanted it. Even your own memories can be more or less false. So in that sense, it's a very bleak view. It's a very bleak view of this world that Dick gives us. And yes, he's writing about the 21st century and space wars, Star Wars, if you will. But really, I think it's a reflection on the 50s and 60s and what's happening there. So that is Philip K. Dick and his speculations on paranoia and power. And so the next lecture and the concluding lecture in our study of postmodern fiction will be about Ursula K. Le Guin. So thanks very much and have a great day.